Welcome to the second presentation, and that is the presentation on political theory. The goals of this presentation are to help us more deeply understand the major questions that political theory addresses, and then the different answers that some people may have. We're just going to go through some examples, and then we're going to try to link this idea of political theory to political ideologies, which allows you then to go to the political compass site and to take the test and to understand, the results of that test. So the focus in political theory is on normative and ethical questions. Normative, remember, is what is ideal, not what is, but what should be. Ethical is what is moral, what is appropriate. So theorists tend to look at the ideal government, the ideal citizen, the ideal sort of public policy, or the ethical approach, the idea of virtue as being the primary ethic, which comes from Aristotle, is a question of political theory. Theorists tend to be less concerned with description. They tend to have a central concern with living what is called the good life, and it varies depending on who's defining what good life means. And the first political theorist in Western tradition, and this is why you take Western civilization here, is Plato. And then Aristotle, of course, a student of Plato, became the first political scientist, even though he also sort of developed a theory of what we call virtue ethics, which is a political theory. So the most important part of Plato that you really need to understand for the study of politics is the allegory of the cave. My assumption is you're aware of the allegory of the cave, but let me just review it very quickly. We have the situation where, it's a parable for political theory where you have a whole bunch of people who are chained in a cave and they can only see straight ahead, but there's a path behind them and there's fire illuminating the cave, and so as these objects pass or these shadows cast upon the wall, that then the chained people see. So day by day after day after day they see these shadows going by, and so they assume that that's a reality, and that becomes normal for them, and that becomes the thing that even if they're chained they're comfortable with, because they kind of see the same thing. The world is predictable. Humans like predictability. Whenever there's a new thing, according to Plato's allegory of the cave, there's a reason to be uncomfortable. I remember when I came home as a vegetarian my first semester in college, in part because of a homily a priest gave, my parents were really kind of taken aback because I had eaten my favorite meal was sausage and peppers and ham and potato salad. Now I come home and I'm saying, oh, I'm not eating meat anymore. And it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? We send you away only a few miles from home and you come back a communist. It's a bit of a joke, but they kind of started calling me the communist, or at the time, Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union. And so this whole idea of new things as being uncomfortable is part of this allegory of the cave. And so the exposure to the world sort of becomes very familiar to people who are chained and they only see the shadows going by, and day by day they see the same shadows, and so they think that that's what reality is. And then someone leaves the cave, they get unchained, go to college in my case, and then they come back and say, hey, look, all this new stuff is happening. Cave dwellers, according to Plato, aren't very happy, and they kill the bearer of the news about the world outside the cave, because they'd rather deal with the normality that they know than try to sort of process this contradiction that is making them feel uncomfortable. So often Plato's allegory of the cave is essentially an invitation to become a critical thinker, but also with a warning that, look, if you become a critical thinker, a lot of people aren't going to be very happy with you. So the question is thinking critically about politics akin to Plato's individual? And yeah, critical thinking is sometimes at odds with the status quo of our cave. And so as you start thinking critically, you tend to disrupt the status quo. An example is American exceptionalism. That's our notion that we're chosen, often by God, a creator, and we're unique among all others in the world, and so we have a duty and obligation to lead it. That's something that the United States tends to embrace, but the reality is it may or may not be a fair description of what our role should be. But those who criticize it are often ostracized as being anti-American or self-hating Americans. So those who don't think we have a special role are often vilified by the dominant view that we are different. A lot of political theorists have been vilified because they challenge the status quo, whether it was Socrates, Edmund Burke, who lost his election after he said, hey, look, I owe you only my good judgment. I don't represent your interests. I actually was elected to make good decisions. And guess what? They threw him out of office the next election. Karl Marx, Mary Wollstonecraft, these are political theorists who have challenged our existing knowledge and approach to the world. And so there are some fundamental ethical questions that political theorists ask. First is, what purpose should a state serve? In other words, we have a state, meaning a country that controls its own borders and is seen as legitimate. What's its purpose? For Plato, it was to promote justice. Of course, Plato thought just behavior is basically following your natural position. Some of you are just workers. Some of you are auxiliaries, which means kind of mid-level managers and leaders, but not big decision makers. And then there are the guardians. So for Plato, each person had their own natural position, and we had to figure out what those were. That's what the Republic was about, setting up the ideal state where we can figure out who the guardians are supposed to be. And then everybody else, whether they're auxiliaries or workers, sort of obeys those guardians. In that kind of notion of the state, any kind of striving for advancement of an individual or any notion that people should be equal is considered a problem. That you don't really want a democracy according to Plato, or at least Plato's Republic, because that is not a just system. The just system is one that's ruled by the guardians, the ones who are chosen or supposed to or superior. For Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, the purpose of a state is to keep us all alive. That Hobbes, who was one of the first liberal philosophers, believed that we had a state of nature that was miserable. Now, a state of nature is the existence that we had before we created government is what is the state of nature. And it's fictional, it's fantasy. Philosophy often uses fantasy. And so in the state of nature, basically everybody's going to kill everybody else because, I want something from you, I'm stronger than you, I'll take it, but then there's someone stronger than me, and sometimes we have to kill each other to get it, and that's miserable. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, is what Hobbes sort of argued in the state of nature. And so what happens is you create government to protect us. And that's what he called the sovereign, or the Leviathan, the great beast, the great whale, depending on whose interpretation. The sovereign is the one to keep us alive, and they retain all power because that power enables them to protect us, but we also in exchange have to obey, and so they can do whatever they want so long as they protect our lives. The second big question is, what is the role of the state in promoting equality? Equality is everybody treated the same? Well, for Aristotle, it wasn't really everybody's treated the same, but it's the equal consideration of all interests. And what that means is that regardless of who's in charge, regardless of whether the system is equal or not, do we consider equally the interests of everybody? Aristotle kind of said, look, you can have effective government regardless of whether it's ruled by one, a small number of people, or many. And so he says, well, you have those three different types of rule, and then you have sort of interests of narrow interest versus the general interest. And basically, by creating that 3x2 typology, Plato basically said there are 6 types of systems, 3 of them proper, 3 of them improper. A monarchy is ruled by one, where the monarch looks after the interests of all subjects, not just themselves or herself. An aristocracy is the same thing, where you have a few, the elite in society, rule, but they worry about everybody and they look out for the equality of all interests. And then the third type is where there are lots of people who rule. Citizens basically have equal participation rights, and the citizens are looking out for the interests of all, not just themselves. That's called a polity. The improper version, tyranny, an individual who basically rules for their own benefit. An oligarchy, a small number of people like in Russia who control virtually everything and keep all the resources for their own, don't worry about the masses. And then democracy. Democracy is where lots of people are involved, that citizens sort of control government, but they're only looking out for their narrow self-interest. And so Aristotle saw democracy as actually a bad form or an improper form of rule by the masses. For Jefferson, however, the idea of equality is the equality of natural rights. And, Jefferson is an Enlightenment era philosopher who in the Declaration of Independence very clearly spells out that every individual is created naturally equal, and we all possess these rights that are sovereign unto ourselves. And government's role is to protect those rights to allow us to maximize our freedom. And he says, look, if government actually aggresses or exploits or denies these equal natural rights, then the individuals may overturn such government. This is very different from Aristotle. Equality is not achieved through the ends of government, but is possessed by equal individuals. And so, the difference in understanding equality is that Aristotle worries about how government functions in the end, whereas Jefferson is arguing about how government protects individuals to be free on their own. So the next question that political theorists ask is, should states maximize their own power or restrain it? In other words, should you have an all-powerful state, total authority, mostly authority, or should you have no state or limited authority? An example of the answer comes from Machiavelli, who says, hey, maximize it. In The Prince, which is considered to be the first sort of document that really ushers in the modern notion of politics and political theory, Machiavelli says, look, you got to use your charisma, your generosity, your force, and the fear that you can instill in people to acquire, maintain, and enhance authority to keep your kingdom unified. Remember, Machiavelli was talking about sort of a very fragmented Italy that was relatively unstable, and he was trying to explain to the prince how the prince might actually maintain sort of more central control, whether it's through good means or through fear. And he talked about, you can be loved or feared, but if you have to choose one, pick fear. So James Madison, the architect of the U.S. Constitution, basically says, no. States should not maximize power. They should intentionally restrict their power, because the ultimate goal of government is individual freedom, which means government should be limited. And the way that you do that is you take all the power of government that maybe a prince would have or a monarch would have, and you separate it into 3 different institutions, but then you give them overlapping authority to control each of their duties. So Congress can check the president can check Congress, the courts can check both the president and Congress, but the president and Congress can both check the court. Then you have national government, your state and local government, they can check each other, and you of course have the Bill of Rights, which, Madison was a very pivotal person in getting the Bill of Rights added into the Constitution. And that says Congress can't take these powers away from people. So again, James Madison's answer is very different than Machiavelli's, but they're asking the same question. How much power should the state have? The next big question in political theory is whether states should try to help us to be ethical people. For John Stuart Mill, who is a liberal thinker, philosophy of liberalism, basically said, look, let individuals do it for themselves. Let them discern on their own through the marketplace of ideas to make their own decisions. They have as much freedom to be wrong as they do to be right. So long as no harm is done to others, government needs to basically let people So leave them alone, let them make their own decisions, and they do it through their own discernment process. So John Stuart Mill says states really need not be part of this. That's very different from the classical notion and what we see these days, in contemporary politics, of the thinkers of religion or theology, that the state's main goal is to uphold the capital T truth. That the role of the state, the role of government, is to preserve, protect, and enforce a certain morality. Fundamentalism is probably the clearest example of that there's a religious truth out there, that it's authoritative, it's compelling, and it's a code by which the government must organize. In the United States, you see that in fundamentalism, you see it in the Taliban, in Afghanistan, you see it in ISIL, Daesh, whatever we're going to call it, and you see it elsewhere in the world too, where there's this natural right that needs to be enforced of God's truth. So again, religious truth is authoritative, compelling, and government has to enforce that. That's the other answer on the other side of the extreme political philosophy from John Stuart Mill. So now that we have examined the sort of ideal questions, or the questions asked by political philosophy, we now have to sort of link it to the next presentation on ideologies. What is the difference between ideologies and how are they linked? Well, as I've been saying, political theory is a notion of the ideal. What is the ideal arrangement of the state? How does the state do what the state is supposed to do, again, depending on the particular normative perspective that you have. It remains normative, it remains sort of conceptual, and it's not really very practical. It can be, but it's not practical. What makes a political theory practical is essentially a political ideology. Political ideology starts with that normative perspective that you may hold about the role of the state. So it should be strong, or it should be limited, or that it should enforce morality, or it should basically allow individuals to do whatever they want to do. It starts with that normative belief. And then it goes and says, well, all right, how does the world not conform to the ideal? And then the third step is, okay, we need to get to the ideal, here's how we're going to do it. And so political ideology is a practical application of normative beliefs through a very clear, explicit, coherent set of principles and plans to get it into place. We're going to look at that a lot more in the next presentation, where I go through an explanation of what ideology is, and then how we come to our current understanding of the different political ideologies. But again, political theory provides the philosophical basis for the practical application that we call political ideology. So, on to the next one.